Welcome to another episode of Context with me, Dilek Tuna, and today we'll look at recently increasing tensions between Israel and Turkey. Syria's war-torn skies light up once again. This time it's not just missiles that are drawing attention, but diplomatic fallout too. Turkey has denounced Israel's latest round of airstrikes in northern Syria, calling them a breach of international law and a threat to the country's fragile territorial integrity. Israel says it's targeting Iran-linked groups and protecting vulnerable communities near its border, but Ankara warns these actions risk derailing regional efforts to stabilise Syria. And adding weight to Turkey's stance, the United Nations has now spoken out. Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has condemned the attacks, saying they violate Syria's sovereignty and international norms. UN Special Envoy Geir Pedersen has also urged Israel to halt the strikes, warning of deepening sectarian tensions, especially around Damascus and Suwaida, where over 100 people were reportedly killed in just 1 week. With electronic warfare reportedly in play and diplomatic red lines hardening, are we inching closer to confrontation, or is there still room for diplomacy? Now, joining me to discuss this, we have Dilara Aslan, a political analyst in Ankara, and Tom Gross, a political analyst in Tel Aviv. A warm welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Hello.
Now, Dilara, how does Turkey interpret these strikes in light of the UN's condemnation and international law?
Well, Turkey is not very fond of the latest developments because we are seeing growing confrontation between the two countries over influence in Syria. It was reported that the Turkish jets had been therefore issuing warning signals, electronic warning signals, and have been engaging in jamming operation in order to deter Israeli fighter jets from this area. So I think what we are seeing from this is that diplomacy has still room here. I can say that this is a result of the deconfliction talks that have been started between the two countries after Netanyahu and Trump met in Washington early last month. So we see that the two countries are not engaging in any direct conflict and confrontation, but are rather trying still to pursue other means, like we saw in this jamming incident. So we see that they try to deter each other from entering their areas of influence, let's say in Syria, and are still applying diplomacy here instead of direct confrontation.
Okay, Tom, what strategic rationale underpins Israel's decision to continue these airstrikes despite mounting diplomatic pressure?
Well, I would say there are two main things. The first one is maybe a narrower concern, which is the attacks on the Syrian Druze community. The Druze, for anyone who doesn't know, about a 1 million strong minority. They grew out of Islam about 1,000 years ago, but they're not traditional Muslims. And there's a significant Druze minority in Israel, which is very loyal to the Jewish state, one of the most loyal non-Jewish groups in Israel. They serve in combat units in the IDF, in the intelligence services, and so on. And when jihadi elements started massacring Druze in Syria a week or two ago, killing hundreds, and there were horrible videos coming out, there was pressure inside Israel by the Druze for Israel to help the Syrian Druze, which have close relations with the Israeli Druze. And a lot of the Druze in Israel are supporters of the Likud party, which is Prime Minister Netanyahu's party. So there was domestic pressure on Israel to come to the aid of Syrian Druze. So a lot of the airstrikes, the recent airstrikes, were aimed to stop the attacks on Druze and also to send a warning to the government in Damascus, because it is believed that the government in Damascus has, Islamist elements inside it, and some of those, the militia of some of those elements, were responsible for the massacres of Druze civilians, women, children, and so on in recent days. There's a secondary, wider reason, if I can just say very briefly, is that Israel feels itself to be now really on a war footing on all fronts, and it feels itself to not want to be vulnerable at all on any border, and therefore it's also sending warning shots also on the Syrian border to any sort of radical elements, whether pro-Iranian or sort of Sunni Islamist elements, to stay away from the Israeli border. Israel fears, I guess, a land attack from Syria, just as it feared a land attack from Hezbollah in Lebanon or Hamas in Gaza.
Okay. Dilara, do these strikes jeopardize the ongoing efforts to promote Syrian territorial unity, particularly from Ankara's perspective?
Actually, yes. So Ankara's main argument here is, and against Israel also, that instability in Syria, as well as other formulas than a unitary state like federalism or a decentralized system, would cause further instability in Syria, which would thus harm the entire region, stability and the security of the region. And it is saying that federalism, for example, would therefore add to these already the current problems that we are seeing in Syria, the sectarian and ethnic tensions, because it says that, for example, if we see another Kurdish federal system, and the Druze system and the Sunni system, there would be, for example, no guarantee that tomorrow any other Islamist or terrorist forces would thus make advantage of this new federalist state and decentralized system. So it says that a unitary Syria is very vital to accomplish stability in the country, to have a strong centralized government that would thus enable and stop terrorist organizations from entering the country. And this would also contribute to Israel's security itself, Ankara says. But unfortunately, we haven't seen the necessary progress yet on the field, because we are seeing continuing Israeli strikes towards Syria, which Ankara also condemns for hindering the process that the Syrian government is taking up right now.
Okay, and Tom, how does Israel respond to claims from both Turkey and the UN that its actions violate Syrian sovereignty?
Well, I think the jury is out, not just for Israel, but for the West and the international community on the new Syrian government. I think almost all of us were relieved and happy. I was happy to see the Assad regime go. It was a really repugnant government led by Assad. But the new government led by President al-Shara, the jury is out, because he has a background as a hardline Islamist in Al-Qaeda. And the question is, has he become more like a statesman, a Nelson Mandela figure, or is he a wolf in sheep's clothing? Is he a wolf in sheep's clothing, or is he a sheep in wolf's clothing, the opposite? And it's a terrible catch-22, because on the one hand, he needs sanctions to be lifted. He needs to repair the economy, to, as your other guest pointed out, to gain proper control over the whole country, to strengthen the government, strengthen the economy. But he also needs to prove that he doesn't have hostile intent to any neighbor, including Israel. And Israel is feeling very vulnerable because of October 7th attack by Hamas still, but even further back, a previous militant, which was Yasser Arafat, that Israel trusted and allowed to sort of arm, in the end he sort of declared a conflict or war on Israel with the Second Intifada. So Israel is very, very wary of the new government in Damascus. On the other hand, it is, as your other guest pointed out, in Israel's interests that that government stabilizes and brings order and stops non-state actors within Syria from launching attacks. So it's a difficult situation.
Okay. Dilara, with reports of Turkish electronic countermeasures, are we seeing a shift toward active deterrence?
I think, as I mentioned earlier, this is a tactic by Turkey to still choose the path of diplomacy and of deconfliction instead of entering any hot, direct confrontation. So this is a good signal that we are seeing here. And actually, I do not expect any hot confrontation between the two countries, because Israel is a US ally, as is Turkey, and Turkey is a NATO member. So it is very unlikely, also if we look at the historic record, that we would see any direct confrontation between the two actors here. What we are seeing is that the two actors really try to gain influence in Syria right now, because the power vacuum that has been seen now, and we are seeing conflicting interests, unfortunately, between Israel and Turkey, because while Turkey is wanting to see a unitary and stable Syria, I think it is in the interest of Israel to have a decentralized and weak Syria as a neighbor, in order to intervene when necessary, for example, to counter Iranian-linked groups, or to maybe seize potential arms transfers for Hezbollah in Lebanon, which we have seen very often in the past in Syria while the country was under the Assad regime. And I think Turkey's main concern is also here that Israel may try to use the pretext of helping minorities like the Druze community to intervene in the country further, and thereby destabilizing Syria. Its main fear is that the same pretext could be also used for the Kurdish minority one day, which Turkey doesn't want to see as a separate federal entity, but rather being integrated into the Syrian government and the Syrian military.
Okay. Tom, does Tel Aviv see any legitimate regional role for Ankara when it comes to managing threats inside Syria?
Well, yes, I think Israel and Turkey have a complicated relationship. They're often political missives, insults fly. But behind the scenes, there's good intelligence sharing, and the two are, to a certain extent, allies, even quite close allies. So I agree with Dilara. I think it's very unlikely that there will be any kind of military or other clash in Syria. But on the other hand, as Dilara pointed out, in the last year and a half, thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of rockets were fired from Lebanon, Hezbollah, at civilians in Israel, and therefore Israel has a paramount interest in not allowing Iran to send missiles via Syria into Lebanon. So as Dilara pointed out, Israel does want freedom of action to hit missile smuggling convoys and other arms convoys traveling through militant groups traveling across Syria. And Israel does want to retain the right, the freedom of action to do that. So, yes.
Dilara, how does Turkey plan to uphold Syria's sovereignty while avoiding direct confrontation with Israeli forces?
Well, actually, Turkey doesn't prefer to engage directly in Syria in this regard. It voices frequently that it is the Syrian government's duty to manage its own relations with foreign actors, as in this case with Israel. So we are seeing that, of course, Turkey is in negotiation and in talks with the Syrian administration currently and the whole time. But on the other hand, it doesn't want to get directly engaged in this field of diplomatic maneuver that the Syrian government has to take. It is, of course, consulting Ahmed al-Shara's government whenever needed. But on the other hand, we are seeing that Shara currently, of course, with in accordance with Turkish expectations, is trying to give the message to Israel that it is no threat to the country or to any other country in the region. We had also seen previously that Shara has also very openly and clearly voiced that it doesn't want any confrontation with Israel, and has even left the door open for normalization with the country. I think when we look at the fact that we have seen no recent attack from Syria to Israel, especially after Bashar Assad's fall, this is a positive momentum that the Israeli government should take. And I think that Turkey is expecting that the two actors, Israel and Syria, will find a common ground and a legal base for any cooperation on that manner and coordination.
Okay. And Tom, can Israel balance its immediate security goals with the broader need to avoid a regional spillover?
Well, I think, on the one hand, President al-Shara in Syria has made quite encouraging noises towards Israel. He even mentioned the possibility down the line, or he didn't rule it out, of Syria joining the Abraham Accords, which were the regional normalization agreements between Israel and the UAE and Morocco and Bahrain and Sudan, which may expand soon to Saudi Arabia. It's quite possible that President Trump, the Trump administration, is working on expanding the Abraham Accords. And down the line, Syria and indeed Lebanon could come in and normalize with Israel. On the other hand, Islamist forces within the new government, or aligned to the new government, have massacred thousands of civilians, Alawites in March, and Druze, hundreds of Druze more recently. So, Israel wants to see action. They want to see the government of al-Shara really proving itself to be statesmanlike and aligned, let's say, with the West or the international community, and not aligned with sort of radical Islamism. So on the one hand, yes, al-Shara is making good noises in various ways, and he kind of has to, because he wants to persuade European and American politicians to fully lift sanctions which were imposed under the Assad regime against Syria. But on the other hand, he's got armed gunmen associated with the regime massacring minorities within Syria. So obviously Israel fears those very same gunmen, unless disarmed and de-radicalized, could one day cross into Israel and massacre Israeli Jews.
Dilara, what steps is Ankara calling for beyond condemnation to prevent further escalation?
Well, Turkey's aim is, as we mentioned earlier, to give mainly the message that stability in Syria will ensure stability and security for Israel in the region. We have seen backdoor diplomacy here with the deconfliction talks. We also know that both through allies and also directly, there is intelligence sharing and long, good record of relations between Israel and Turkey, which have, of course, been affected after the October 7 attack by Hamas. But still, these relations are very deep-rooted and didn't really break up at this process. But what Turkey now wants to see is not to get directly engaged in Syria. Of course, it is there to help and consult the Syrian government, but it wants the Shara government to take things into its own hands, both through legal means to re-establishing the country's institutions, and also establishing the relations with other countries, including Israel. As is the case with Israel, we are also seeing, as our guest mentioned, that Syria also has to forge new relations with the West, but also with the Arab countries, for example, which are also suspicious of the Islamist backgrounds of Shara. So especially in the case with Israel, Turkey wants that direct diplomacy is being established between the Israeli government and the Syrian government here.
Okay, lastly, Tom, could this increase in diplomatic scrutiny influence Israel's military calculus in Syria moving forward?
Well, just one thing before I answer that.
Go ahead, sure.
Israel, I mean, look, the Israeli government's certainly not going to say this publicly, but they are leaving a military option open about hitting the Iranian nuclear program. If the peace talks, the de-escalation talks between the Trump administration and Iran don't succeed in removing the Iranian nuclear threat. And Israel would likely have to fly over Syrian airspace were they to launch airstrikes on nuclear sites in Iran. And therefore, Israel wants to maintain freedom of action over southern Syria. And this could be part of the calculations behind the scenes for Israel. In answer to your other question about diplomatic pressure, I mean, Israel, of course, is still heavily involved in a war with Hamas in Gaza. It's being hit by the Houthis in Yemen. It's not completely stopped conflict with Hezbollah. Hezbollah is still active, they're weakened in Lebanon. So Israel is balancing all kinds of military and diplomatic and economic and other strategic goals. So of course, diplomacy plays a big part, but you know, I think at this point, Israel will also take what measures it deems necessary to defend its borders and its population from attack and from airstrikes and so on. So yes, diplomacy is important. Yes, the UN is important. But like other countries, Israel will put its own defense of its own citizens ahead of, you know, resolutions at the UN.
Okay, Tom, thank you so much for joining Context today. And Dilara, also a very warm thank you to you as well for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's where we'll leave it for now. Now, as international warnings grow louder and regional powers draw firmer lines, Syria once again finds itself at the centre of competing agendas. Whether diplomacy can cool the skies remains to be seen. From all of us here at Context, I'm Dilek Tuna. Thanks for watching.